The pine trees on either side of the narrow lane hold perfectly still. Not a branch moves. Even the wind seems to pull back, making room for the sound to pass. Then you see them. Nearly 70 motorcycles, rolling in perfect staggered formation down a snow-packed dirt road in rural Oregon on a gray Thursday morning. Their headlights cut through the pale winter air like the eyes of something ancient and unhurried. The chrome of their handlebars catches the weak November sun and throws it back in cold, hard glints. They ride slowly, deliberately, the way a military procession moves with the weight of something that cannot be rushed. The roar of their engines fills the whole world. It vibrates in the aluminum walls of the small trailer at the end of the lane. It ripples the water in a glass on a teenager's nightstand. It shakes a framed photograph loose on a cheap wood-paneled wall. Inside the trailer, a 17-year-old boy named Caleb Norris pushes himself up from the floor where he has been lying since 2 in the morning, still wearing his flannel shirt, still shivering even in the warmth of the heated room. He crawls to the front window. He pulls back the faded curtain with a hand that is still stiff from the cold. He sees them coming. And even though he has never seen anything like it in his entire life, some part of him buried deep and quiet is not surprised at all. But to understand what this moment means, you have to go back. You have to go back 11 hours to a frozen mountain pass in the middle of the night, to a gas station that sits entirely alone on a desolate stretch of Highway 26, like a single lit match in a dark field. You have to go back to the moment when a boy who had almost nothing made a decision that cost him everything he had. That is where this story really begins. Highway 26 through the Cascade Mountains in Oregon is not a road that forgives mistakes. The locals know this. The long-haul truckers know it. The elk hunters who drive it every October know it. And the logging crews who have worked the timber on either side of it for 3 generations know it better than anyone. In good weather, the road is merely unforgiving. In winter, in a blizzard at night, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes a test. November had come in hard that year. The kind of November that old men in diners describe as a settling of accounts, as if the mountain range itself had decided to remind everyone in the region exactly who was in charge. The temperatures dropped fast and stayed low. The first snowfall had come a week early. And on the night of the 3rd Tuesday of the month, with the thermometer at the Parkdale hardware store reading 14 degrees Fahrenheit, and still dropping, a local radio DJ named Hector announced on the 11 o'clock broadcast that a major storm system was tracking directly toward the northern pass and advised everyone in the listening area to stay off the roads. Almost no one was on them, almost. Cooper's Gas and Grub had been sitting at the junction of Highway 26 and the Old Mill Road since 1971. It was a squat, tired building with a flat roof that leaked in 2 places, a set of fuel pumps that dated to the Reagan administration, and a single neon open sign in the window that buzzed faintly like a dying insect. The fluorescent lights inside were the color of old teeth. The coffee had been sitting on the burner since 9 o'clock. The rack of lottery tickets near the register was lopsided because the plastic display had cracked 2 winters ago, and Earl Dawson, the owner and manager, had never gotten around to replacing it. Earl was not there that night. He had a bad knee and a warm house and a wife named Connie, who had been asking him for 15 years to hire enough staff that he did not have to worry about the graveyard shift himself. He had finally listened to her. The graveyard shift belonged to Caleb. Caleb Norris was 17 years old and a junior at Ridgeline High School, where he carried a B average despite the fact that he was running on somewhere between 4 and 5 hours of sleep on any given school night. He was not a large boy. He was lean in the way that teenagers who work physical jobs are lean, with calloused hands and the kind of quiet, watchful eyes that develop in people who spend a lot of time alone. He had his mother's dark hair and his father's jaw, and the careful, deliberate way of moving through a room that belongs to people who have learned early that carelessness costs money they do not have. His father, Gerald Norris, had died 2 years ago in February on a night not entirely unlike this one. He had been driving home from a late shift at the paper mill in Sandy, 40 miles west, when his truck hit a patch of black ice on Highway 26, 3 miles east of the gas station, where his son now stood mopping the linoleum. The truck had crossed the center line. The guardrail had not held. The investigation afterward determined that Gerald had died on impact and probably felt nothing. Caleb did not find this particularly comforting. What Gerald Norris left behind was a wife named Ruth, a son named Caleb, a small drafty trailer on a dirt road off the highway, a 1998 Ford pickup that burned more oil than it was worth, and a stack of bills that had been growing steadily for the 2 years since the accident. Ruth Norris worked as a waitress at a diner called the Ridgeline Family Restaurant in the town of Zigzag, 3 towns east, and she was good at her tune, and the regulars loved her and left decent tips. But her hours had been cut in October when the tourist season ended and the diner went back to its off-season schedule, and the stack of red-stamped past-due envelopes on the kitchen table had quietly, steadily become something that neither she nor Caleb talked about directly anymore. They talked around it. They talked about other things. But it was always there between them, solid as furniture. Caleb had gone to Earl Dawson 3 weeks ago and asked for extra hours. He had stood in the man's small back office and kept his voice steady and his eyes straight and made the request plainly without embarrassing either of them by explaining more than was necessary. Earl had understood. He had 2 daughters of his own and remembered what it felt like to be young and responsible for things that should not have been his responsibility. He gave Caleb the graveyard shift 4 nights a week. The one thing standing between Caleb Norris and the bitter reality of a 2-mile walk home in the dark every night at 2 in the morning down an unlit dirt road through the Cascade foothills in the dead of an Oregon winter was a jacket. It was a Carhartt, the heavy-duty insulated work jacket in dark canvas fleece lined with reinforced elbows and a collar that could be turned up against the wind. It was practically brand new. He had saved for it for 3 months, setting aside a fixed amount from each paycheck with the discipline of a man twice his age, ignoring the vending machine at school and the fast food places his classmates favored, and the one time he had genuinely wanted to buy a used paperback at the town's only second-hand shop. The jacket had cost him $212, including tax. He wore it every single night at work. Without it, the walk home was not unpleasant. Without it, the walk home was dangerous. It was 11:45 on that Tuesday night when the snow started coming in hard against the windows of the gas station. Caleb stood behind the counter with a cup of terrible coffee, watching the weather roll in through the pass, listening to the wind pick up speed against the glass. The radio on the shelf behind him played country music at low volume. The kind of old country that nobody under 50 actually chose to listen to, but that gas stations across the American West had been playing continuously since roughly 1979. He was reading a textbook, a chapter on the causes of the First World War, and he was making marginal notes in pencil, and he was doing a fairly good job of staying awake. Then he heard it. A sound through the wind, mechanical, rhythmic, distinctly different from the weather. A V-twin engine. He knew the sound. His father had owned a motorcycle briefly before Caleb was born and had talked about it sometimes in the way men talk about the things they loved when they were young, with a combination of pride and regret. This engine did not sound healthy. It was coughing. It was laboring against the cold in the grate of the mountain road, in a way that suggested it was being pushed well past what it should have been asked to do tonight. Caleb wiped a circle of condensation from the window glass with his sleeve and peered out into the dark. Beneath the single working street light in the parking lot, a Harley-Davidson motorcycle lurched to a stop. The engine gave one final violent shudder, a sound like a man clearing his throat before he falls silent forever, and then it died. The rider sat motionless for a moment, still straddling the machine, as if deciding whether to believe what had just happened. Then slowly, with movements that even through the frosted glass looked stiff and effortful, he swung one heavy leg over the seat and kicked the stand down. He walked toward the neon open sign. Caleb had been told by two of the older clerks who sometimes covered weekend shifts to keep his head down around motorcycle club riders. Not to engage, not to make eye contact, not to do anything that could be interpreted as disrespect or on the other side as invitation. Just ring them up, keep your face neutral, and let them go. The clubs that passed through in summer were loud and numerous and did not generally want conversation from a gas station clerk. They wanted fuel and convenience store coffee and to be back on the road. But this was not a pack of riders in summer. This was one man in November, in a storm. And as he pushed through the door and a blast of sub-zero air came with him and scattered the lottery tickets off the crooked rack, Caleb saw immediately that something was wrong. The man was large, 6'4", at least broad across the shoulders, built with the kind of mass that suggests a life of physical labor and not a gym membership. He had a thick, graying beard that was Caleb noticed with a start partially frozen. Solid ice crystals had formed in the lower half of it. His hands hanging at his sides were bare. His knuckles were the color of raw meat. He wore a thin flannel shirt, dark with melted snow under a heavy leather vest. Even in the shaking, uncertain light of the gas station, the patches on that vest were unmistakable. The top rocker curved over a grinning skull with outstretched wings. The bottom rocker named his territory. The Death's Head logo of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club earned and worn on a man who had clearly been riding in a blizzard at midnight in a flannel shirt with no insulation layer and no gloves. He was shivering, not the polite, suppressed shivering of someone who has come in from the cold and will warm up shortly. He was shaking with the deep, uncontrollable violence of a body that has been fighting cold for too long and is starting to lose. His lips were the wrong color. Caleb had taken a first aid course the previous spring as an elective because it counted toward his science credit. The instructor had spent one full class on the signs and stages of hypothermia with photographs that Caleb had not forgotten. Pale skin, blue lips, uncontrolled shivering, confusion, slurred speech. The instructor had been very clear: by the time a person looks the way this man looked, the window for easy intervention was narrowing fast. "Don't tell me you're closed, kid." The man's voice was deep naturally, the kind of voice that carries across a loud room, but it was trembling badly, broken up by the shivering into fragments. It was the voice of a man forcing words out through a body that wanted to shut everything down. "No, sir. Open till 2. Caleb kept his own voice steady, though his hand tightened on the edge of the counter. The man nodded and moved toward the back of the store where a small electric space heater sat on the floor glowing orange. It was an ancient thing, the kind that produced more noise than warmth, but it was the best the station offered. The man practically folded himself down onto a milk crate beside it, holding his massive bare hands out toward the weak orange glow. He was bent forward at the waist, elbows on his knees, head dropped in the posture of someone who has been fighting something for a long time and has just found a place to stop for a minute. Caleb came around the counter. He filled a large styrofoam cup with coffee from the burner without being asked. It had been sitting for 2 hours, and it was not good coffee under any circumstances. But it was hot, and hot was what mattered. He walked to the back of the store and held the cup out. The man reached for it. His hands were shaking badly enough that when he got hold of the cup, coffee sloshed over the rim and landed on the back of Caleb's knuckles. The burn was real. Caleb held on. He helped guide the cup until the man had both hands wrapped around it and a grip that would hold. The man looked up. His eyes were dark alert in the way that eyes stay alert even when the rest of the body is failing, because that kind of man does not allow himself the luxury of going unfocused even when he is in serious trouble. He studied Caleb for a moment with the direct appraising look of someone who has spent a long time learning to read people quickly. "Thanks, son." He took a long pull of the coffee. He did not wince at the temperature. "I'm Duke. Duke Harlan." He said it as a statement, flat and complete the way a man gives his name when he is used to it meaning something in the room where he says it. "Caleb. Caleb Norris." Duke Harlan looked at him for another second, then back at the heater. "Alternator gave out," he said. "Lost the headlight 2 miles back. Been riding blind since then. Roads like glass up on the pass." Caleb said nothing. He stood a respectful distance away and watched the man drink the coffee and watched the trembling in his hands and thought through the situation methodically, the way his father had always told him to think one fact at a time. "Do you need me to call someone?" Caleb asked carefully. "A tow service." Duke's head came up fast. "No tow, no police." He said it without heat, just flatly the way you state a condition that is not subject to negotiation. "Yes, sir." Duke set the cup down on the floor between his boots and pressed both hands flat against his thighs. He seemed to be making a decision about how much to say. Then he said it. "I got a brother up at St. Jude's Medical Center in Portland. They called me an hour ago, said he's not making it through the night. I need to be there." His voice was flat and precise, and it cost him something to say it that plainly. As he said it, something else happened that Caleb almost missed. Duke's right hand moved from his thigh to his chest, pressing flat against his sternum for just a moment, and then returned to his thigh as if the movement had not occurred. It was brief and automatic, the gesture of a man who has been doing it long enough that he no longer notices. Caleb noticed. He filed it away without comment. Caleb felt the words land. He knew what it meant to get a phone call like that. He knew the specific quality of panic that lived in it, the feeling of distance turning into a physical weight, the way every minute between you and the hospital becomes something you will have to account for later. He had not made it to the hospital the night his father died. The roads had been bad and his mother had not wanted to frighten him, and by the time they got there, it was already over. He had been 15 years old and he had stood in a hospital corridor under fluorescent lights and understood for the first time that the world did not pause for you to get ready. "Portland is 40 miles west," Caleb said quietly. "The roads are icing over. Even if your bike was running, you'd never make it in this storm. Not the way you're dressed." Duke looked at him. The expression on his face was not anger. It was something more honest than anger. It was the face of a man who knows exactly what the situation is and has decided to proceed anyway because there is no other option he is willing to accept. "I'll hitchhike. I'll walk if I have to. I am not letting him die alone." He tried to stand up as he said it, his legs folded. He sat back down hard on the milk crate, one hand going out to grab the shelf beside him. He held himself there, breathing carefully, and Caleb saw the effort it cost him to keep his face from showing what that moment had revealed about how far gone he actually was. The hand went to his chest again briefly, then away. There was a long silence. The space heater hummed. Outside, the snow had picked up. Caleb could hear it now against the windows, heavier than before, a sustained white rush that had buried the parking lot under an inch and a half in the time since Duke had walked in. Nobody was going to be stopping on Highway 26 tonight for a hitchhiker. The road was empty and getting more dangerous by the hour. Caleb looked at the clock on the wall behind the register. It read 11:52. He thought about Ray Beaumont. Ray was a long-haul trucker out of Prineville who ran the Portland Road twice a week and had been stopping at Cooper's Gas and Grub for as long as Caleb had been working there. He was a big, gruff, unhurried man who smoked cheap cigars and always paid cash, and occasionally left the diesel pumps in a condition that required significant cleanup before the morning shift. Caleb had covered for him on that more than once without making an issue of it because Ray was decent when it mattered, and because Caleb had learned from his father that small favors handled quietly add up. Ray's rig was parked behind the station. Caleb had seen it pull in around 10, the engine idling, which meant Ray was sleeping in the cab before his late run. He made the Portland run regularly. He would be heading right past St. Jude's. "Wait here," Caleb said. He went out the back door. The cold was immediate and total. His Carhartt took the first shock of it, the thick canvas and fleece lining absorbing the impact of the sub-zero wind the way a good jacket was supposed to, and he tucked his chin and sprinted around the side of the building to where the 18-wheeler sat idling in the dark, its running lights a dull orange row along the roof of the cab. He climbed the steps and pounded on the door. It took 2 minutes and considerable noise before the window rolled down and Ray Beaumont appeared heavy-eyed and profoundly unenthused about being woken up. Caleb talked fast. He explained the situation without unnecessary detail. Stranded biker medical emergency in Portland, no other option. Ray listened with the neutral, slightly skeptical expression of a man being asked to do something that was going to complicate his night. "I'm heading out in 3 minutes anyway," Ray finally said. "He can ride. But I'm not waiting, kid." 3 minutes and I roll. Caleb ran back inside. Duke was still on the milk crate, but he had his head up now, and his color was marginally better. The coffee and the heat had done some work. He looked at Caleb coming back through the door, and something shifted in his expression. "I got you a ride. Trucker out back is heading straight to Portland. He'll drop you 2 blocks from St. Jude's." Duke stood up. This time his legs held. He reached out and gripped the shelf for a moment, steadying himself, then let go. He was upright and he was moving, and for a second the force of the man was fully visible, the sheer physical presence that had obviously defined him for decades before this cold night had stripped it down to something more essential. "I owe you, kid." He said it the way men who mean things say them quietly without decoration. He took a step toward the door. Then the door opened on its own, or rather the wind hit it at the precise moment Duke reached for it and shoved it inward, and the full force of the storm came through that gap like something with intent. It was not a gust. It was a sustained wall of sub-zero air moving fast, carrying ice crystals that stung the skin on contact. Duke stopped walking. He stood in the open doorway for a moment, and Caleb watched the cold go into him. Watched the shivering restart harder this time, and watched the man's jaw set against it. The truck had a broken heater. Caleb knew this. Ray had mentioned it 2 weeks ago, complaining about it, explaining that it was scheduled for repair, but not until the following week. A 40-mile drive in a truck cab with no heat in a man's current condition in a wet flannel shirt, with nothing over it but a leather vest that the wind would cut straight through. Caleb ran the math. Duke was already in stage 2. His core temperature was already down. The truck cab would be somewhere around 20 degrees inside. 40 miles at a cautious storm speed, probably an hour and 15 minutes minimum. A man with a compromised core temperature, no insulation, wet clothing, sitting still in a freezing cab for over an hour. He thought about the hand pressing against the chest, twice in 15 minutes, automatic and unconscious. He thought about what that might mean for a man 58 years old, shivering in a frozen doorway, about to sit motionless in a freezing truck for over an hour. He would not make it to the hospital. He would arrive unconscious, or he would not arrive at all. Caleb looked at Duke standing in the doorway. The giant man had both hands braced on the doorframe, fighting the wind, fighting the cold, fighting the knowledge that his body had finally hit its limit. There was nothing theatrical about it. There was no drama in the man's face. There was only the quiet, exhausted look of someone who has been told by every available fact that he is not going to make it and has not yet decided whether to accept that. Then Duke turned and looked at Caleb, and in that look was something that Caleb recognized. It was the same look his father had given him once years ago when the old truck had broken down on a back road in the dark and Gerald Norris had looked at his 12-year-old son and said without words that he was out of ideas and was open to suggestions. Caleb reached up and unzipped his jacket. He did not think about it at length. There was no extended deliberation, no catalog of reasons for and against. The math was already done. It was cold and the math said one thing, and Caleb had been raised by a man who believed that when the math said one thing and your comfort said another thing, you went with the math and you did it without making a speech about it. He slid the Carhartt off his shoulders. The absence of it was instantaneous and shocking. The cold came in through his thin flannel shirt like water through a screen door. He held the jacket out. Take it. Duke stared at the jacket. He looked at Caleb, standing there in his flannel with goosebumps already forming on his forearms. He looked back at the jacket. Kid, are you out of your mind? I saw you looking at that clock. You gotta walk home, don't you? I'll run. It'll keep me warm. You need this more than I do. The truck doesn't have a heater. If you don't take this jacket, you are not going to make it to your brother. Duke did not move for a moment. In the world that Duke Harlan inhabited, the world where everything of value was earned over years and paid for in full, and where nothing was handed across a counter without a price attached, the gesture in front of him did not compute at first. He had spent 30 years moving through a world that ran on power and leverage and carefully maintained reciprocity. Nobody gave you something for nothing. The code was clear on that. You earned what you had. You paid what you owed. You did not accept charity because charity created a debt that could not be properly settled. But he looked into the face of the boy holding the jacket, and there was nothing in that face that resembled calculation. There was no angle being played. There was a 17-year-old kid in a drafty gas station at midnight who had done the same math Duke had done and arrived at the same answer and was acting on it without asking for anything in return. Outside, a long air horn blast split the night. Ray Beaumont was not a patient man. Duke reached out with a trembling hand and took the jacket. He pulled it on over his leather vest. The canvas was warm from Caleb's body heat, and the thick fleece lining trapped it immediately, and Duke went still for a second with the expression of a man who has been very cold for a very long time and has just been given back the one thing he needed most. Caleb, Duke said. The tremor in his voice was smaller now. He reached into the breast pocket of his vest. He pulled out a silver Zippo lighter and held it out flat on his palm. It was heavy, well-worn, engraved on one side with a design Caleb could not quite make out in the bad light. I don't forget, and we don't forget. Caleb took the lighter. It was ice cold against his palm. Duke turned and pushed through the door and jogged toward the idling truck. Each footfall on the packed snow was deliberate and controlled. The passenger door of the 18-wheeler swung open. Duke pulled himself up and in. The door shut. The big diesel engine growled, and the rig began to move its headlights, sweeping across the Snowberry parking lot, and then it was gone, swallowed by the white dark of the storm. Caleb stood at the window and watched the taillights disappear. He looked down at the Zippo in his hand. He turned it over. On one side, visible now under the store's fluorescent light, was an engraved death's head. He slid it into his pocket. It was 12:31 in the morning. He had an hour and 29 minutes until the end of his shift. The next 90 minutes were the longest of his life. Every time the wind hit the windows, which was constantly, the cold found him through the thin cotton of his flannel, like it was looking for him specifically. He turned the space heater to face the counter and stood close to it and drank the rest of the terrible coffee and tried to read the chapter on the First World War, but the words would not stay in order. He kept looking at the clock. He kept listening to the storm. He kept thinking about the math. 2 miles, 10 degrees and dropping, unpaved road, black ice. He had told Duke he would run. At 2 o'clock, he locked the front door and shut off the neon sign and turned off the fluorescent lights and stood in the dark for a moment, listening to the building settle around him in the cold. He put on his work gloves. He zipped his flannel shirt to the collar. He put his hands in his pockets. He pushed the back door open. The cold did not negotiate. It hit him across the face and chest with a directness that stopped his breath for a full second, the way very cold water does when you jump into it. His lungs seized, his eyes watered, and the tears froze on his lashes before they could fall. The wind was moving horizontally off the mountain loaded with ice crystals, and his flannel offered it nothing at all to push against. Within 30 seconds, the skin on his arms was covered in goosebumps so dense they were painful. Within 2 minutes, his teeth were chattering so hard his jaw ached. He started to run as he had promised himself he would. The first 50 yards went all right. The motion generated some heat, and he kept his chin tucked and his arms tight and focused on the ground ahead of him in the weak spill of light from the station's back door. Then the light gave out behind him and the road went dark, and he hit the patch of black ice. He went down hard on his right hip, and the breath came out of him in a grunt. And he lay there on the frozen dirt for a moment, palms flat on the ice, feeling the cold come up through his clothes from below as well as from above, surrounded on all sides by it now. He got up slowly. His hip throbbed. He moved forward again, but slower, testing each step before committing to it. He walked 1 mile, then the second. He counted his steps. He focused on the weight of the Zippo in his pocket and the way it pressed against his thigh, a small, hard fact in the dark. He thought about the walk his father used to describe taking to school when he was Caleb's age. Back when the family had lived in a different part of the state, and things had been harder in different ways, and how Gerald Norris had always ended those stories with the same line said with a small smile, "And I made it, didn't I?" That was the whole story, the hardship and then the making it. He could not feel his feet anymore. His hands, even inside the gloves, were wooden and unresponsive. His ears felt as though they were being compressed in a vise. He focused on the fact that the coal was a fact, and that facts could be moved through, and that at the end of the dirt road there was a trailer with a heating vent in the floor, and his mother's space heater, and a bed with 2 blankets on it. He saw the porch light when he was still 200 yards away, a faint yellow smear in the dark, and something in him, some last careful reserve of forward motion released. He stumbled the last stretch. He climbed the metal steps by feel his hands unable to grip properly, fumbling with the key for a long and humiliating time before the lock turned. He pushed the door open. He got inside. He kicked the door shut behind him and sank onto the carpet and lay there. He could hear the heating vent under the floor ticking with warmth. He pulled himself toward it on his elbows and curled around it like something returning to a source. He shivered for a long time, deep bone deep shivering that had nothing to do with choice, the kind that goes in after you are warm because the body has been doing it for so long, it has forgotten how to stop. At some point, the shivering eased. He did not remember closing his eyes. The Zippo was pressed against his thigh, cold and hard, the engraved skull invisible in the dark. He held one hand over the vent and thought about Duke Harlan in the cab of Ray Beaumont's truck on the icy highway west, wrapped in a canvas jacket that smelled like a 17-year-old kid's shift at a mountain gas station. He thought about a man named Frank Tillman in a hospital room in Portland, waiting for someone to arrive before the night was over. And then underneath those thoughts, quieter and older, he thought about his father. About the way the accident report had said the truck crossed the center line 3 miles east of the gas station where Caleb now worked 4 nights a week. About the way it felt to know that every night when he walked home, he walked the same road his father had driven for the last time. About whether that meant something or whether it meant nothing, and whether the difference between those two options was something a person could figure out or something they just had to carry. He did not know. What he knew, lying on the worn carpet in the dark with the heating vent under him and the Zippo pressed against his leg, was that he had done the right thing and it had cost him something real, and he was going to pay for it in more than one way over the days ahead, and none of that changed what the math had said. He had given his only warm thing to a man who needed it more. He was 17 years old. He fell asleep on the floor. 40 miles west, in the harsh white light of the emergency entrance at St. Jude's Medical Center in Portland, a truck driver named Ray Beaumont was helping a very large, very cold man in a canvas Carhartt jacket out of the cab of an 18-wheeler. A nurse was already moving toward them with a wheelchair. The man refused the chair but accepted the arm. As they moved through the sliding glass doors into the warm lobby, the man reached into the pocket of the borrowed jacket, instinctively checking for the Zippo he always carried, and then remembered where it was. He stopped walking for just a moment. His jaw tightened. Then he kept moving because there was still somewhere he needed to be, and a boy back on the mountain who had made sure he could get there. He did not know yet what he was going to do about that boy. He only knew that he was going to do something. The gray light came first. It crept through the frost on the trailer windows slowly, the way winter light always moves in the Cascades without enthusiasm, as if the sun itself is reluctant to fully commit to a day this cold. It found the living room floor. It found the heating vent. It found Caleb Norris curled on the threadbare carpet, still in his flannel shirt, his knees drawn up to his chest, one hand tucked under his cheek and the other closed loosely around a silver Zippo lighter that had left a faint rectangular impression on his palm. He did not hear his mother get up. He did not hear the kettle. He did not hear her padding from the kitchen to the doorway in her thick wool socks, and stopping there, the ceramic mug of tea warm between both hands, looking at her son on the floor, with the particular expression of a woman who has learned to assess a situation before she reacts to it. What she saw, a boy who had not made it to his bed, a flannel shirt she recognized as his work shirt, damp at the collar, the unmistakable posture of someone who had been very cold for a long time and had finally stopped moving at the nearest available horizontal surface. No jacket. Caleb. She said it softly at first, then again with more presence. He opened his eyes. The ceiling of the trailer looked back at him. He became aware of the aching in his hip where he had fallen on the ice, the rawness in his throat that had not been there yesterday, the deep settled fatigue in his chest that was different from tiredness and felt more like something structural. He sat up slowly. Ruth Norris set her mug on the kitchen counter and crossed the room in 4 steps and pressed her palm flat against his forehead, The automatic gesture of a mother who has been doing this since he was small enough to fit in the crook of her arm. Her hand was cool and dry, and he felt the warmth of it even through the fever he could now feel radiating out of his own skin. "You are burning up," she said. It was not a question. "Honey, where is your jacket?" He looked at the floor, at the worn edge of the linoleum near the heating vent. He thought about the jacket, and he thought about Duke Harlan, and then he thought about the particular quality of his mother's face at certain moments, the way it could hold grief and practicality at the same time without either one canceling the other out. And he said what he had already decided to say on the walk home in the dark. "I left it at the station. I was in the back checking inventory, and when I came out, it was gone. Someone must have taken it." The silence that followed was short, but complete. Ruth Norris looked at her son for a long moment. Something moved in her expression, crossed it briefly, and then settled the way weather crosses an open field. She looked at the floor. She looked back at him. "Get into bed," she said. "I will make you something hot." He did not argue. He pulled himself up off the floor, his hip protesting, and made his way down the narrow hallway to his room and got into bed without taking off his work clothes because the thought of being separated from any layer of fabric was genuinely unpleasant. He pulled both blankets up to his chin. His body immediately began the slow, grateful work of warming a space inside the bedding, and he lay there looking at the water stain on the ceiling that had been there since before his father died and listened to his mother moving in the kitchen. The fever came in fully over the next 2 hours. It was not dramatic. It was the ordinary misery of a body that has been pushed past a reasonable limit and is now presenting its bill. He drifted in and out of a shallow, restless sleep in which the images were fragmented and not entirely his own. The parking lot under the single streetlight, Duke's frozen beard, the way the canvas jacket looked almost small in the man's massive hands as he pulled it on, the sound of the truck's air horn in the dark, the weight of the Zippo in his pocket on the walk home, the ice under his feet, and the way the ground came up to meet him when his hip gave out. He was still drifting when he heard his mother come into the room. She set a bowl of soup on the nightstand, the canned chicken noodle she kept on the high shelf for sick days, and she sat on the edge of the mattress near his feet with her mug of tea, and she looked at him for a moment before she spoke. "Ray Beaumont called this morning," she said. "The fever made everything slightly slower than it should have been, but not slow enough." Caleb heard the sentence clearly and felt what it meant with complete precision. "He said he drove a man from the station to Portland last night. He said you arranged it. He said he has never seen a kid act faster in a bad situation. He said the man was in a serious condition when he got into that cab, and he was in better condition when he got out of it, and Ray said the only reason for that was something you did." She paused. He did not look at her. She said, "Caleb, look at me." He looked at her. Ruth Norris had the same dark hair as her son, though there was gray in it now that had not been there 3 years ago. She had her own mother's cheekbones and the steady brown eyes of a woman who has worked service industry jobs for 20 years and learned to read a room in seconds. She was 43 years old, and she looked capable and tired, and she was looking at her son now with an expression that was not anger, though it contained the bones of anger inside it. "I am not upset about the jacket," she said. "I need you to hear that first. I know what you did, and I know why you did it, and you did not do anything wrong." She set her mug down on the nightstand next to the soup. "I am not talking to you about the jacket. I am talking to you about the road." She stopped. She pressed her lips together and looked at the window. "You walked home last night on Highway 26, in the dark, in a blizzard, without a coat, on the same road where your father died." The sentence sat in the room like a third presence. Caleb opened his mouth. She raised one hand. Not a sharp gesture, a quiet one, the kind that has nothing left to prove. "You are 17 years old," she said. "You are all I have, and you walked 2 miles in the dark in February level temperatures on the road that took your father, and you did not tell me, and you did not call me, and when you got home, you did not wake me up. You lay on the floor by the vent, and you let me find you in the morning." Her voice did not break. She had spent 2 years learning not to let her voice break in front of him, and the practice had made her very good at it. But her hands wrapped around the mug she had picked back up were holding it tightly enough to show the tendons in her knuckles. Caleb said, "I know." He said it quietly and completely, not as an apology, but as an acknowledgement of a fact that was simply true. Ruth nodded once. She smoothed the edge of the blanket near his feet. "Drink the soup before it gets cold," she said. She stood up. She went back to the kitchen, and he lay there in the small room in the pale gray light and understood that there are two ways to inherit grief from your parents. There is the grief they leave when they and there is the grief you cause the ones who remain when you remind them, even accidentally, that they could lose you the same way. His mother had been carrying the second kind since he started working nights on that road. He had not fully understood that until now. He drank the soup. He slept again. He did not dream, or if he did not remember it. The road to Portland runs west from the Cascade foothills, through the Sandy River Valley, past the dark timber country where the Douglas firs press close on both sides and the river appears and disappears in the dark below the road, and then down into the broadening flatlands east of the city where the lights begin and the world stops feeling like wilderness and starts feeling like somewhere that has an emergency room. Ray Beaumont's rig had made good time once they cleared the worst of the mountain pass. He was a careful driver in bad weather, unhurried and methodical, and he did not try to make conversation, which Duke Harlan was grateful for. Duke sat in the passenger seat with the canvas jacket pulled tight and his hands flat on his thighs and his eyes forward, and he said nothing for 40 miles except to tell Ray when they were getting close to the St. Jude's exit. He was still shaking when they pulled up to the emergency entrance. Not as badly as before. The jacket had done its work, but his core temperature was not right, and he knew it the way you know things about your own body after 58 years of using it hard and paying attention. The sliding glass doors opened. A nurse in green scrubs was already moving toward him with the practiced efficiency of someone who assesses situations for a living. He refused the wheelchair. He accepted her arm. She took one look at his color and his lips, and the way he was moving, and redirected him immediately away from the main waiting room and toward a treatment bay where another nurse appeared with a blood pressure cuff and a thermometer, and the kind of direct professional manner that does not allow for argument. His temperature was 94.1 degrees Fahrenheit. The nurse explained this to him in a tone that made clear she considered it a problem requiring immediate attention. He explained to her that he needed to be in room 417. She explained to him that room 417 would still be there in 30 minutes and that the man in it would be better served by a visitor who was not in the early stages of hypothermia. He sat in the treatment bay with warm blankets wrapped around him and an IV in his arm, and the canvas jacket folded on his lap because he would not let them take it, and he counted the minutes. The attending physician was a compact, precise man named Dr. Ewan. He reviewed the intake numbers and told Duke what he already knew. Stage 2 hypothermia, manageable, no cardiac event, get warm and stay warm. Then he told Duke something else said with the particular directness of a physician who does not believe in softening facts unnecessarily. A man of his age, he said, with the cardiovascular history Duke's intake information suggested riding in an unheated truck cab at the ambient temperature Ray Beaumont had described, without adequate insulation, sitting still for over an hour. While already in stage 2, the likelihood of cardiac arrest before reaching the city was very high. The insulated jacket, Dr. Ewan said, was the deciding variable. Duke looked at the folded canvas jacket on his lap. He thought about a kid in a gas station at midnight taking it off his own shoulders without being asked, standing there in a thin flannel shirt in a freezing building with 2 miles of black ice between him and home. He said nothing. He let the IV run. 31 minutes after he arrived, he walked out of the treatment bay and took the elevator to the 4th floor. Room 417 was at the end of the corridor past the nurse's station and the family waiting area with its low-slung upholstered chairs and its stack of magazines. Nobody reads, and its institutional coffee maker that had been producing the same mediocre results since the wing was built. There was a light on inside the room, the soft, indirect kind they use in rooms where the overhead brightness would be unkind. Duke stopped in the doorway. Frank Tillman was 71 years old, and he looked every year of it and then several more. He was a large man who had become a smaller version of himself over the preceding months, the way serious illness subtracts from a person not just weight, but presence, as if the body begins quietly returning things it borrowed. His hair was white and thin against the pillow. His hands lying outside the blanket still had the wide knuckles and the old tattooed skin of a man who had spent his life doing physical things, but they looked unfamiliar somehow. Too still. Not the hands Duke had known. His eyes were open. They moved to the doorway, and they found Duke standing there, and something came into them that was not surprise. It was recognition of a specific and complete kind, the way you recognize someone you have been waiting for. Duke walked in. He pulled the chair up to the side of the bed. He sat down. He put one hand over Frank's right hand on the blanket, and he did not say anything for a long moment because there was too much to say, and none of it could go first. Frank looked at him. His gaze dropped to the canvas jacket still folded over Duke's arm. "Who gave you that?" Frank said. His voice was thin but clear. He was not confused. The mind behind those eyes was still entirely present, whatever else had been diminished. Duke looked down at the jacket. He set it on the edge of the bed between them. A kid. A kid at a gas station up on the pass. My bike gave out and I was in bad shape, and he gave me the only warm thing he had. Frank was quiet for a moment. His thumb moved slightly against the back of Duke's hand. "How old?" Frank said. 17. Another silence. The monitor beside the bed registered Frank's pulse in small, regular peaks, patient and unhurried. Frank said, "Does he know you?" No. Frank closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, he said, "He gave his jacket to a stranger in the middle of the night in the winter on a mountain road." Duke said yes. Frank said, "How much did it cost him?" And Duke, who had not considered this question until this moment, thought about the jacket and thought about the kid's flannel shirt and thought about him saying, "I'll run. It'll keep me warm," and understood without being told that the jacket had not been a spare. He understood that a 17-year-old working a graveyard shift at a gas station on a mountain pass in the middle of winter was not a kid with extras. The jacket had been the jacket, the only one. It cost him everything he had, Duke said. Frank Tillman looked at the ceiling. "Find him," Frank said. He was not speaking loudly, but the words had weight. Not to say thank you, because a kid who does something like that should know that it mattered. He should know it before he decides it was stupid. Duke said, "I know." Frank said, "You were like that at 17, before the world got to you." He paused. "Before I got to you." Duke looked at the wall. He said, "You never got to me the way you think you did. You were headed somewhere bad," Frank said. "You know that. I know that. I pulled you out. I know that too. And here you are anyway," Frank said. and there was something in it that was not regret and not satisfaction, but some mixture of the two that only belongs to very old relationships. After 30 years, in a borrowed jacket, Duke said, "I wasn't going to let you go without somebody here." Frank said, "I know you weren't. That's the only reason I held on this long." They sat together in the quiet room. Outside the window, the sky over Portland was beginning to separate from the darkness into the dark gray that precedes dawn, a gradual, reluctant brightening that offered no warmth and only the faint promise of visibility. The city below was still largely silent, the early morning emptiness before the first commuters and delivery trucks began their work. Duke talked. He did not talk constantly or fill the room with words. He talked the way you talk to someone you have known for 30 years, when you know the time left is finite, and you want to use it for things that have not been said rather than things that have been said many times already. He talked about the chapter, about the ride he and Frank had made 15 years ago down the California coast, the one they had been planning for years and had finally done on a week in October when the weather was perfect and neither of them had any obligations. They could not put aside the week they had talked about afterward as the best ride either of them had ever made. He talked about the night Frank had shown up at the county jail at 2 in the morning when Duke was 28 years old and facing charges that would have changed the shape of the rest of his life, and had simply told the duty officer that he was there to take responsibility for his chapter brother, and had said it with such absolute certainty that the officer had not questioned it. Frank listened with his eyes closed sometimes and open others. He asked questions, occasionally small ones, just enough to show he was following. At 3:45, Frank said, "You know what I never told you?" Duke said, "There are probably things." Frank said, "The night I came to get you, at the jail, I remember. I was scared," Frank said. He said it plainly as a fact. "I was scared the whole drive there. Scared you would not come out with me. Scared you would look at me and decide the road you were on was more interesting than the road I was offering. You were 28 and you were angry at everything, and you had reasons for the anger. Not everybody takes the other road when someone shows it to them." Duke said, "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because you should know that the things you do for people that you think are ordinary are not ordinary to the person you do them for," Frank said. "That kid on the mountain, what he did was not small. Make sure he knows that." Duke said he would. Frank Tillman died at 5:47 in the morning as the pale gray dawn light was coming through the window of room 417 at St. Jude's Medical Center in Portland, Oregon. He died with his hand in Duke Harlan's hand, and his breathing went from slow to slower to stopped in a sequence that was quiet and complete. Duke sat beside him for a long time after, in the silence that follows the end of a very long thing, not crying, because Duke Harlan had not cried in public since he was 19 years old, and did not intend to start now, but sitting with his head bowed and his hand still over Frank's still hand, and letting the room hold what the room needed to hold. A nurse came in softly and said the things that nurses say, and offered the things that hospitals offer at these moments. And Duke thanked her with the formal, deliberate courtesy that he used with people in situations where courtesy was the only thing he had to give. He picked up the Carhartt jacket from the edge of the bed, where it had been sitting all night. He folded it carefully. He pressed the canvas flat with his palm. Then he went to the waiting room at the end of the corridor, and he sat down in one of the low-slung upholstered chairs, and he took out his phone. Stone Maddox answered on the second ring, which told Duke that Stone had not been sleeping, which told Duke that Stone already knew. Duke said, "He's gone." There was a silence on the line that contained more than silence usually does. Stone said, "I know. The hospital called the chapter contact 20 minutes ago. I have been sitting here waiting for you." Stone Maddox had been president of the Portland chapter for 11 years, which was long enough that most of the chapter had never known it any other way. He was 54 years old, built low and solid with a scar running through his left eyebrow that he had never explained to anyone who had not been there when it happened. His eyes had the quality of very still water, the kind that looks calm from above but moves in its own ways underneath. He had known Frank Tillman for 23 years, and Frank had been the reason Stone had stayed in the chapter at a point in his 30s when he had seriously considered leaving, and he was not going to discuss any of that now on the phone before sunrise. He said, "Are you all right?" Duke said, "I'm functional." Stone said, "Tell me about the kid." Duke paused. He had not expected Stone to lead with that. He said, "Ray told you." "Ray talks," Stone said without judgment. "Tell me yourself." Duke told him. He told it plainly and completely, the way he would report anything to Stone, without editorializing, just the sequence of facts in order: the gas station, the coffee, the truck arrangement, the jacket, the walk home the kid had in front of him, the math that Duke had done, standing in the doorway in the storm. He told Stone what Frank had said, looking at the jacket. He told Stone what Frank had asked him to do. When he finished, there was another silence. This one had a different quality. Duke said, "I left him the Zippo." Stone said, "I know." "You told Ray." Duke said, "It's not enough." Stone said, "No, it's not." A pause. Duke could hear something in the background on Stone's end. Movement, a chair scraping back, the particular sound of a man getting to his feet. Stone said, "What do you know about the kid, the family?" Duke said, "His father died 2 years ago. Car accident on the same highway. Mother works at a diner. He's working the graveyard shift to cover bills. Walks 2 miles home in the dark after every shift. No car." Stone was quiet for a moment, and Duke could hear him thinking the way you learn to hear someone think after enough years of knowing them. Stone said, "How old is the trailer?" Duke said, "I didn't see it, but he's walking 2 miles to get back to it, so it's not in town." Stone said, "Ray told me the road." Ray told me more than that. Duke heard the sound of Stone's boots on a floor. Then he heard another voice in the background lower, and then another, and understood that Stone was not alone, that others from the chapter were there in the early morning dark because Frank Tillman was gone. And when something like that happens, the chapter does not scatter. It pulls together the way all things pull together when a center is lost and needs to be reestablished. Stone came back on the line. He said, "Duke, Frank was a founding member. He sponsored 9 men in this chapter over 30 years. He built the relationships that keep this chapter whole. There is not a fully patched member in Portland who does not owe something to Frank Tillman directly or through someone Frank brought in." Duke said, "I know that." Stone said, "A 17-year-old kid on a mountain road in the middle of the night gave everything he had so you could be there when Frank went. So Frank did not die alone. You understand what that means to this chapter?" Duke said, "I understand." Stone said, "Then you understand that we have a debt." Duke said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Frank told me to find him, to make sure he knows what he did mattered, before he decides it was stupid." Stone said, "Frank always was ahead of the rest of us. He told Duke to get some sleep. He said he would handle the arrangements. He said Duke should stay in Portland until they came." Duke said, "When?" Stone said, "Tomorrow morning. Early." He hung up. Duke sat in the hospital waiting room in the quiet of the earliest part of the morning and looked at the Carhartt jacket in his hands. It was a plain utilitarian thing. Dark canvas, fleece lining, reinforced elbows. The kind of jacket that gets worn in weather like last night's by people who work outside and have practical needs and cannot afford to think about anything except whether the thing will hold the heat. He thought about a 17-year-old kid taking it off his own back in a freezing gas station and handing it across the counter without ceremony or expectation. He thought about Frank's face when he said he should know that it mattered. He thought about being 28 years old in a county jail and watching Frank Tillman walk through the door with that absolute unreasonable certainty. Outside the hospital window, Portland was waking up. The sky had gone from dark gray to a lighter gray. A city bus moved along the street below. A delivery truck double parked at the corner of the next block. The ordinary machinery of an ordinary Thursday morning, indifferent to what had happened in room 417, moving forward on its own schedule. Duke Harlan sat with the jacket on his lap and the weight of a 30-year friendship settling into the space where Frank Tillman had been, and he did not move for a long time. Back in the Cascade foothills in the small town of Winding Creek, the morning had its own business to conduct. Deputy Sheriff Marcus Greer arrived at Cooper's Gas and Grub at 9:15 on Thursday morning in his patrol cruiser with the heater running and a large coffee in the cup holder, and the particular expression of a man who has heard something that interests him professionally. He was 46 years old, lean with the careful grooming and the slightly too formal posture of someone who takes his institutional authority seriously. He had been with the county sheriff's department for 19 years, and he knew every business on every road in his patrol territory, and he prided himself on knowing more about what moved through it than any two other deputies combined. He had heard through the network of information that small-town law enforcement runs on that there had been an incident at the gas station on Highway 26 the previous night, a motorcycle club member, an unplanned stop, a trucker heading to Portland. He had heard some of this from the scanner and some of it from a call he had made at 8 in the morning to Ray Beaumont's dispatch company, where the night dispatcher had been forthcoming in the casual way that people are forthcoming when they do not yet realize they are providing information to someone who intends to use it. Earl Dawson was behind the counter when Greer came in working through the morning paperwork with his reading glasses low on his nose. He looked up when the deputy walked through the door and had the brief, involuntary expression of a man whose first reaction to law enforcement is mild inconvenience rather than reassurance, which was the honest reaction of most small business owners in the county who had dealt with Greer before. "Morning, Earl," Greer said. He helped himself to a coffee from the fresh pot. He leaned against the counter in the way that indicated he was not in a hurry. He asked Earl about the previous night. He asked about the biker. He asked about the Hells Angels patch. He asked about the boy who had been working the shift, getting his name from Earl without asking directly for it, which was a technique Greer had learned worked better than a direct question because it made the person providing the information feel like they were having a conversation rather than being interviewed. Earl answered carefully. He said yes, there had been a man with a breakdown. He said yes, he had been a club member. He said yes, Caleb Norris had been working the graveyard shift. Greer asked conversationally whether this was the Norris kid whose father had been killed on this road a couple years back. Earl said yes, that was the family. Greer nodded slowly and drank his coffee and looked out the window at the pumps. He asked whether Caleb had seemed friendly with the club member. Earl said he did not know the details, he had not been there. Greer asked whether Earl knew if there had been any exchange of anything between them. Earl said he did not know. Greer thanked him and left. He sat in his patrol cruiser in the parking lot for a few minutes with the engine running. He looked at the gas station and he looked at the empty highway and he thought about what he knew and what he intended to find out. He had been watching the Portland chapter for 2 years. He had a file. He had names and plate numbers and a general sense of their routes and patterns through the county. He had not yet had cause to make any moves which frustrated him in the particular way that watchful men are frustrated when the thing they are watching declines to provide a clear opportunity. A 17-year-old boy on the highway in the night with a Hells Angels member was not nothing. It was a point of contact, a thread. He pulled out of the lot and headed west. He did not go to the trailer that morning. He would make inquiries, first build the picture properly. He would find out what the Norris kid looked like, where he went to school, whether there was anything in the boy's background worth noting. He was not going to move quickly. Quick was how you made mistakes. He turned the cruiser south toward the county road. In the trailer at the end of the dirt lane, Caleb Norris slept through the morning with a fever of 101 degrees, and his mother sat in the kitchen with her tea and her worry, in the distinct knowledge arriving fully formed sometime around 10 o'clock, that whatever her son had done on that mountain road the previous night was not finished. That thing set in motion did not simply stop because the night was over, that the Zippo lighter on his nightstand was not a souvenir, that Ray Beaumont had called not just to compliment her son, but to warn her in his gruff, indirect way that Caleb had put himself into a story that was still being written. She did not know how it would be written. She did not know yet about Frank Tillman or Stone Maddox or the quiet phone call happening in a hospital waiting room 40 miles away while her son slept off his fever. She knew only what Ray had told her, which was that her boy had done something extraordinary in an ordinary moment, and that the man he had done it for was the kind of man for whom that kind of thing did not simply pass without consequence. She poured the last of her tea down the drain. She washed the cup. She stood at the kitchen window looking out at the dirty snow in the yard and the pine trees beyond it and the white winter sky above it all. At the edge of her hearing, if she had been listening for it, she might have heard nothing yet. The road outside was quiet. The day was still. The mountains held their cold and their silence in equal measure. But by the time her son woke up again, feverish and restless and guilty about the jacket, he had not actually lost. The phone calls would be done. The decision would be made. And somewhere in Portland, in the early morning quiet after a hard night, a group of men who had just lost a founding member would be making preparations for a debt that they intended to settle in full. Thursday morning, early, Stone Maddox had said early, the sound came back. It was the same sound that had opened this story, the deep mechanical rumble moving through frozen ground and up through the soles of your feet before your ears have time to name it. But now Caleb was hearing it from the inside of a fever dream, and for a long, confused moment, he could not tell whether it was real or whether his body, still fighting the cold it had swallowed 2 nights ago, was manufacturing noise out of nothing the way fevers sometimes do. Then the water glass on his nightstand began to tremble. He opened his eyes, the ceiling of his room, the water stain, the thin winter light coming through the curtain. He lay still and listened, and the sound grew and deepened and became something that a ceiling and 4 walls of aluminum siding could not contain, something that pressed against the trailer from all sides simultaneously and vibrated in his back teeth and in the base of his sternum. Ruth appeared in the doorway of his room. She was holding the edge of the door frame with both hands and looking at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before, which was the expression of a person who has been partially prepared for something and has just discovered that partial preparation is not the same as actual preparation. "Caleb," she said. He was already sitting up. His head swam with the effort, and the fever pushed back against him, but he swung his legs over the side of the bed and pushed himself upright and moved past her into the hallway and then into the living room where the faded curtain over the front window was trembling faintly from the vibration coming through the wall. He pulled the curtain back. They were already there. The columns stretched the full length of the narrow lane from the junction with the county road all the way to the small cul-de-sac in front of the trailer, and it was still moving, the rear of it still rounding the corner as the front came to a halt. They rode in tight, disciplined formation, two staggered rows the way a military unit moves when it wants to demonstrate that it moves as one thing and not many. The exhaust from nearly 70 engines rose in white columns in the cold morning air. The chrome of their handlebars caught the pale winter light and returned it harder and sharper than it had arrived. Every rider wore a leather cut over a heavy hoodie or flannel. Every cut bore the same patches. The death's head on every back facing forward, the top and bottom rockers naming the chapter and the territory. They were not young men, most of them. They were men in their 40s and 50s, and some of them older, with gray in their beards, and the particular physical solidity of people who have spent their lives doing hard things and have not yet decided to stop. The neighbors' curtains were moving. Nobody came outside. One by one, with a synchronization that seemed almost choreographed, the kickstands went down. 70 of them hitting the asphalt in a rolling sequence like a slow wave moving from the front of the column to the back. The riders dismounted, and then the engines went quiet one after another until the last one cut out, and the silence that followed was so complete and so sudden that it felt like a physical pressure in the ears. Ruth had come to stand beside Caleb at the window. She was not touching him. She was standing very straight and very still, with her arms crossed over her chest and her jaw set in the way it set when she was managing something that frightened her by refusing to let it show. "Caleb," she said, her voice very low and very controlled, "I am going to call the sheriff." No, he said it quietly, but with the kind of certainty that stops a conversation rather than continuing at it. "Mom, please, let me handle this." She looked at him. He was 17 years old, and he was running a fever, and he was in his work clothes from 2 nights ago, and he was asking her to trust him, which was something Gerald Norris had asked her regularly, and which she had learned over 20 years to evaluate on a case-by-case basis rather than reflexively. She did not reach for her phone. A single figure had detached itself from the front of the group and was walking up the concrete path toward the door. He was not tall in the way that Duke Harlan was tall, but he was built with a density that communicated something different from size, the kind of physical presence that comes from absolute certainty about where you are and why you are there. He had a scar through his left eyebrow that caught the light in a way that made it more visible than it might otherwise have been. His eyes, even at this distance, had a quality of stillness that Caleb recognized from the faces of certain teachers and certain older men. He had known the quality of someone who has decided things in advance and does not need to decide them again in the moment. He stopped at the door. He did not knock. He stood there. Caleb crossed the living room. He was aware of his own heartbeat and the way the fever made everything slightly too bright at the edges. He was aware of his mother standing behind him and the weight of what was outside the door and the weight of the Zeppo on his nightstand and the 2 nights of everything that had led to this moment. He unlocked the deadbolt. He opened the door. The cold came in around the man in the doorway, carrying the smell of exhaust and leather and the particular cold of an Oregon winter morning that has not yet decided to warm up. The man looked at Caleb for a moment, a direct assessing look that lasted long enough to be deliberate. "You, Caleb," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes, sir. Stone Maddox, Portland. Chapter President." He looked past Caleb to where Ruth was standing in the living room, and something in his expression shifted, not softening exactly, but adjusting the way a person adjusts their register when the situation calls for it. "Ma'am," he said with a formality that was genuine rather than performed. "Apologies for the noise. We are not here to cause any trouble." Ruth said nothing. She was holding herself very still. Stone looked back at Caleb. He reached into the deep inside pocket of his leather vest, and Caleb flinched before he could stop himself. A purely physical reaction with no thought behind it, and Stone registered it and did not react to it except to slow the movement, deliberately giving Caleb time to see what was coming before it arrived. What came out was the Carhartt jacket. It was clean, professionally clean, the kind of clean that requires a commercial laundry and not a washing machine. The canvas dark and even-toned, and the fleece lining white again. Instead of the gray it had been accumulating for months of graveyard shifts. It smelled faintly of industrial cleaning solution and something lighter underneath. Not Caleb's smell anymore, but not entirely erased either, as if something of the jacket's history had survived the process. Duke asked me to bring this back to you, Stone said, holding it out. Caleb took it. The familiar weight of it settled into his hands, and he held it for a moment without speaking. Is Duke all right? He said. Did he make it? Stone's face did not change much, but something moved through his eyes briefly, like weather crossing water. He made it. He got to St. Jude's at 1:45 in the morning. He had 4 hours with Frank before Frank passed. He was holding his hand. Stone paused. Frank Tillman was a founding member of our Portland chapter. He was the man who pulled Duke out of a situation 30 years ago that would have destroyed him. He sponsored Duke into the chapter. He was the reason a lot of men in that column behind me are the men they are today, instead of something else entirely. He looked at Caleb steadily. If Duke had not been in that room when Frank went, it would have broken something in him that does not repair. You understand what I am saying to you. Caleb said, I just got him a ride. Stone said you gave him the only warm thing you had so he could survive the ride you got him. Dr. Ewan at St. Jude's told Duke that the insulation in that jacket was the difference between arriving and not arriving. Those are the doctor's words, not mine. Caleb held the jacket and said nothing. Stone said, You don't get it yet. That's all right, let me finish. He turned and made a brief single gesture toward the column of men behind him. 2 riders came forward from the front of the group, moving with the unhurried, purposeful gait of men who know exactly what they are carrying and why. The first one was carrying a thick manila envelope. The second was carrying something draped over his arm, something dark and heavy folded with care. Stone took the envelope from the first rider and held it out to Caleb. Caleb took it. It was heavy in a way that envelopes are not usually heavy, dense with the specific weight of paper currency in significant quantity. His hand dropped slightly with the unexpected mass of it. There is $12,000 in there, Stone said, the same flat factual tone he might use to describe the weather. Every fully patched member in the Portland chapter and the Salem chapter emptied their wallets this morning. Ray Beaumont told Duke about your situation. Your father, your mother's bills, the walk home in the dark every night. Ruth made a sound in the hallway behind Caleb. A small sound quickly controlled. Stone continued. You pay off this trailer. You settle your mother's accounts. You quit the graveyard shift and you finish high school. Those are not suggestions. Caleb looked at the envelope. He looked up at Stone. He said, I can't take this. It was just a jacket. I can't take $12,000 for a jacket. It is not a gift, Stone said. It is a settled debt, a debt this chapter owes to a kid who made it possible for our founding member to die with his family beside him. You hand that back to me and you insult every man standing in that lane. There was a pause. Then at the corner of Stone's mouth, very briefly, the beginning of something that might, in different circumstances, have become a smile. Don't hand it back, Stone said. Caleb did not hand it back. Stone took the second item from the rider carrying it and held it out. It was a leather jacket, not a club cut, a motorcycle jacket, the kind with the wide lapels and the heavy brass hardware and the diagonal front zipper, made from black leather that had been worn and worked and broken in over years until it had the particular suppleness of leather that has been lived in rather than merely purchased. It was lined with thick, natural shearling, cream-colored and dense, the kind of lining that holds warmth the way nothing synthetic can quite replicate. It was not new. It had the specific character of something that had been worn by someone who had mattered. This belonged to Frank Tillman, Stone said. He held it out toward Caleb, and Caleb took it carefully the way you take something that has weight beyond its physical weight. Frank had no children, Stone said. He had the chapter, and he had the men he sponsored, and he had the road. He left specific instructions about his personal effects. This jacket he left to Duke with instructions that Duke could give it to whoever Duke decided deserved it most. Stone paused. Duke called me from the hospital at 6 this morning. He told me what Frank said about you. He told me what Frank asked him to do. And he told me who he wanted the jacket to go to. Caleb looked at the leather jacket in his hands. The shearling lining was warm even without a body in it. He turned it over. On the inside of the left breast, in the silk lining, someone had written in black marker, in the careful, slightly labored handwriting of a man more accustomed to physical work than to writing, Frank Tillman, Portland, 1987. The year the chapter was founded. Check the inside pocket, Stone said. Caleb reached into the interior breast pocket of the leather jacket. His fingers found something folded and he drew it out. Not one thing. Two, the first was a piece of paper folded once. The second was a small rectangle of cardboard folded twice with a phone number written inside it in pen area code 503. He unfolded the paper first. It was a handwritten letter on plain paper written in the same careful, unaccustomed hand as the inscription in the jacket. Not elegant, not composed with any literary intention. Just a man writing down what he needed to say. It read, Caleb, I don't know you. Frank did not know you, but why Frank looked at that jacket you gave me, and he knew everything about you that mattered. He said you reminded him of me at 17 before the world got to me. I don't know if that is a compliment given how things went for me for a while, but Frank meant it as one, and I am passing it along as one. What you did was not small. The doctor told me you saved my life. Frank told me you saved something that mattered more than my life. I am not a man who says thank you easily. Consider this me saying it the only way I know how. Duke Harlan, Portland. Below the letter was a photograph. It was old, the color slightly faded, and the edges soft in the way of photographs that have been handled over many years. It showed two people standing in front of a motorcycle in what appeared to be a parking lot in summer. The man on the left was clearly Frank Tillman, younger, maybe 40, broad and solid, wearing a leather cut and squinting slightly into the sun with the expression of a man who finds having his photograph taken mildly ridiculous, but is tolerating it for the sake of the person asking. The person on his right was a young man, maybe 17 or 18, lean and dark-haired, with the watchful eyes and the careful posture of someone who has learned early that carelessness costs money they do not have. Caleb looked at the photograph for a long time. The young man standing next to Frank Tillman in the summer parking lot looked in certain specific and unambiguous ways like Caleb Norris. Not identical, not a copy, but the resemblance was the kind that crosses the years and the faces of strangers and says something about the way certain kinds of people are shaped by certain kinds of circumstances into certain kinds of expressions. The same quality of watchfulness, the same set of the jaw, the same way of standing as if ready for something without advertising the readiness. Stone was watching him look at it. Frank said something last night, Stone said. He said that a kid who does something like what you did should know it mattered before he decides it was stupid. Caleb looked up. Stone said, "Did you decide it was stupid?" Caleb thought about the walk home, about his hip on the ice, about lying on the floor by the heating vent and cursing himself and thinking about 3 months of saved money disappearing into a blizzard, about the fever, about lying to his mother. He said, "I had a moment." Stone said, "That's honest. That's good. Men who never have the moment are usually men who never did anything worth having the moment about." He nodded toward the folded cardboard in Caleb's hand. "That is a phone number," Stone said. "You have a problem. You have someone causing you trouble. You have something you cannot handle on your own. You call that number and you say that Duke and Stone said you are under the shield. You understand what that means." Caleb said he thought so. Stone said, "It means nobody touches you. Nobody touches your mother. Nobody in this county or any county adjacent to it with any knowledge of who we are puts their hands on you or your property or your family without answering to every man in that lane. You are not a member. You are not affiliated. You are a civilian under our protection. There is a difference and it matters. What it means practically is that you live your life without the weight of being alone in it when something goes wrong." He paused. "It also means you finish school and you do something with yourself," he said, and now there was something in his voice that was not quite severity and not quite humor, but occupied the territory between them. Frank would have required it. "I am requiring it in his name." Stone looked past Caleb to Ruth and addressed her directly. "Mrs. Norris," he said, "your son did something in the dark on a mountain road that most grown men would not have done. He did it without an audience and without expectation of anything in return, and he paid a real price for it. You raise that. Whatever else you are dealing with, that is yours." Ruth Norris, who had held herself together through the death of her husband and 2 years of bills and worry, and the specific exhaustion of being the only adult in a household that needed more than one, looked at the man in her doorway, and her composure, which was considerable and hard-won, developed a single visible crack. She pressed one hand over her mouth. She did not make a sound, but her eyes filled and she did not look away. Stone nodded at her once with the grave formality of a man who respects grief and does not try to manage it. Then he turned back to Caleb. He was about to say something else when the patrol cruiser turned into the lane. It came slowly, the way official vehicles come when their driver wants to be noticed and wants time to observe before being observed. The engine was quiet under the idling rumble of the parked motorcycles, and the cruiser moved through the gap in the column where the lane was just wide enough, the riders on either side not moving, not acknowledging it, simply remaining where they were in a way that communicated their opinion of the interruption without requiring words. Deputy Marcus Greer stopped the cruiser 20 feet from the trailer. He got out. He was in full uniform, his hand not on his weapon, but carried in a way that kept it available, and he walked up the concrete path with the slightly elevated posture of a man asserting jurisdiction over a situation he has walked into without quite enough information. He looked at Stone. He looked at the column of men in the lane. He looked at Caleb standing in the doorway with a leather jacket and an envelope and a letter and a photograph and a small folded card. "Morning, Deputy," Stone said. His voice had not changed. His posture had not changed. He simply turned toward Greer with the same stillness and spoke to him with the same flat, even register he had been using throughout. Greer said, "I'm going to need everyone to state their business here." Stone looked at him for a moment without speaking. It was a particular kind of silence. Not hostile, not uncertain. The silence of a man deciding how much of what he knows to use. He said, "Marcus Allen Greer, 19 years with the county, house on Fur Ridge Road in Brightwood. Your wife Connie works the front desk at the dental practice on Main. Your daughter Sophie is a sophomore at Ridgeline High, same school as Caleb here." Greer went very still. Stone said, "We know everything about this county that matters to us, Deputy. We have been riding these roads for 30 years. We are here this morning on private property at the invitation of the resident to settle a private matter. There are no laws being broken. There is no disturbance of the peace. There is a family receiving a visit from people who owe them something." He let that sit for a moment. Then he said, "You have been building a file on this chapter for 2 years. We know that too. You are welcome to continue building it. You will find the same thing in year 3 that you have found in years 1 and 2, which is that we ride, we pay our debts, and we do not operate in ways that give county deputies actionable material. What you will not find, Deputy, is anything that connects this boy or this family to anything that concerns your department, because there is nothing to find. And if you continue to look for it in ways that put pressure on this family, that will be a problem. Not a threat, a problem. There is a difference." He said it the way you state a fact about weather or geography. Flat, complete, without inflection, that could be called menacing, and therefore quoted back later. Greer stood on the concrete path for a moment that lasted several seconds longer than was comfortable. Then he said, "I'll be watching." Stone said, "That is your right and your job. Deputy, you drive safe now." Greer walked back to the cruiser. He got in. He sat for a moment, not moving the engine, idling. Then he put it in reverse and backed slowly out of the lane the way he had come, in the column of riders shifting fractionally to let him through without making way, a subtle and entirely intentional distinction. The cruiser turned onto the county road and was gone. Caleb had not moved during any of this. He had watched it the way you watch something that is happening on a scale slightly larger than you have reference points for. He had watched Stone Maddox stand on his family's front step and quietly dismantle the leverage of a county deputy with nothing but the flat recitation of known facts, and he had understood something about the nature of power that no classroom had yet taught him. That it does not always announce itself, that the loudest thing in the room is not always the most formidable thing in the room, that real authority sometimes sounds like a man describing the weather. Stone turned back to him. He said, "You understand what just happened?" Caleb said yes. Stone said, "Good, because that was not a performance. Everything I said to him is true and will remain true for as long as you conduct yourself with the same integrity you showed on that mountain road. You are under the shield. That has meaning and it has conditions. The condition is simple. You live clean. You treat people with the same basic decency you showed Duke when he walked into that station. You do not use the shield as leverage or as a way to avoid accountability for your own choices. You use it when you are in genuine need and for nothing else." Caleb said, "I understand." Stone looked at him for a long moment. He seemed to be confirming something he had already decided. "Good," he said. He turned and walked back down the concrete path toward his motorcycle at the head of the column. Stone swung a leg over his bike. He sat for a moment, both hands on the bars, looking at the trailer, at Caleb standing in the doorway with everything he had been given. Then he kicked the starter. The engine came up with a sound like a contained explosion, deep and resonant, and the sound rolled down the column and met the answering roar of nearly 70 other engines starting in rapid succession, each one joining the next until the full voice of all of them together filled the lane and the tree line and the pale winter sky above it, and pressed against the aluminum walls of the trailer and vibrated in the glass of the windows and in the fillings in Caleb's back teeth. His mother came to stand beside him in the doorway. She put her arm around his shoulders and held on, and he let her, and they stood together watching. One by one, in the same disciplined formation they had arrived in, the column began to move. It turned in the cul-de-sac and straightened out and rolled back down the lane toward the county road. 70 machines moving as one thing, the exhaust rising white in the cold air, the chrome catching the light. Stone Maddox led the column and did not look back. The sound built as they accelerated onto the county road, became something that the surrounding trees could not absorb or diminish, traveled up the hillside and across the frozen fields and out toward the highway, and then over the next several minutes grew slowly, gradually smaller, receding westward through the morning until it was low, and then barely present, and then only the memory of itself. And then it was gone. The lane was quiet. The pine trees on either side stood perfectly still. The tire tracks in the packed snow were the only evidence that anything had been there at all. Caleb stood on the porch with the envelope and the photograph and the letter and the card and the leather jacket that had belonged to a man he would never meet. He stood there for a long time after the sound was gone, looking at the lane, and his mother stood beside him with her arms still around his shoulders, neither of them speaking. Eventually Ruth said, "Come inside. I am going to make you something to eat." He came inside. He sat at the kitchen table and she made eggs and toast, and he ate them slowly while she sat across from him with her tea. The envelope was on the table between them. They were both aware of it, the way you are aware of something large and significant that has just arrived in your life and requires more time than you currently have to fully understand. At some point, Ruth reached out and picked it up. She opened the flap carefully. She counted the bills inside with the practiced, unhurried fingers of a woman who has handled cash transactions her whole working life and knows how to move through a count without losing her place. She counted once. She set the bills down in a neat stack on the table. She sat very still for a moment, her hands flat on either side of the stack. Caleb watched her face. She said quietly, "This is $12,411. He looked at her. She did not look at him. She was looking at the money. She said, "Caleb, that is the exact amount. To the dollar. Everything we owe. The trailer note, the electric, the 2 medical bills from when your father died, and the insurance did not cover the full transport." She stopped. She pressed both hands flat on the table surface and held them there. She said, "How did they know that number?" Caleb thought about Ray Beaumont and how much Ray talked. He thought about Stone Maddox on the phone in the early dark of Thursday morning, asking Duke how old is the trailer, asking about the road, gathering the picture from every available source with the same methodical completeness that had let him recite a county deputy's home address without pausing to look it up. He thought about what it meant that the number was exact, not a round figure handed over in the general direction of generosity. An exact number calculated from specific information calibrated to restore what was owed rather than to exceed it in a way that would feel like charity. He said, "I think they asked the right questions." Ruth looked at the stack of bills for a long moment. "That is not charity," she said, more to herself than to him. "That is something else entirely." She sat with that for another moment. Then she straightened the stack and set it aside and picked up her mug with both hands and held it the way she held it when she was thinking about something that was going to take a while to process, but that she had decided provisionally to accept. At some point, she said, "Ray called this morning because he thought I should know where my son was and what my son had done. He thought I might be worried." Caleb looked at his eggs. "He also told me," she said, "what you said to that man before you gave him the jacket, that you would run, that it would keep you warm." Caleb said, "I did run, for about 50 yards. Ruth looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Your father used to do things like that. Say what needed to be said in the moment to keep someone from arguing and then deal with the reality afterward without complaining about it. She wrapped both hands around her mug. "It used to terrify me," she said. She paused. "It still does." He did not say anything. She said he would have been proud of you. She said it plainly without decoration, the way she said things that were true and had been true for a long time and did not need to be dressed up to land. Caleb nodded. He looked at the window. He thought about Frank Tillman writing that inscription inside the jacket in 1987, the year the chapter was founded. He thought about Duke Harlan at 28 in a county jail and Frank walking through the door. He thought about Frank looking at the Carhartt jacket in the hospital room and asking who gave you that, the way he recognized immediately that something had been sacrificed. He thought about the photograph. The young man standing next to Frank in the summer parking lot, the one who looked back at Caleb from 30 years ago with the watchful eyes and the careful posture and the jaw set against whatever came next. He thought someone did that for him, and then he did something with it, and now someone did something for me. He did not know yet what he would do with it. He was 17 and he was running a fever, and his hips still ached from where he had hit the ice, and the stack of past due bills on the kitchen table had just been quietly, precisely, completely canceled out by a group of men who had lost their founding member that morning and had decided that settling a debt was the first thing that needed doing. He did not know the shape of the years ahead of him any more than the young man in the photograph had known the shape of his. But he knew what Stone had said. You live clean. You treat people with the same basic decency you showed on that mountain road. He thought, I can do that. That afternoon, when his fever had dropped 2 degrees and the soup was gone, and his mother was sleeping in her room for the first time in what looked like several days, Caleb put on the leather jacket. He put his arms through the shearling-lined sleeves and zipped it to the collar, and stood in the bathroom mirror for a moment looking at himself in a dead man's jacket that fit him the way it was supposed to fit, as if the man who owned it had known the dimensions of what came after. He put the Zippo in the right breast pocket. He went out the back door and walked down the dirt road toward the highway. Not the whole 2 miles to the station, just to the junction where the dirt road met Highway 26, and a wooden post stood at the corner with a reflective mile marker on it. He had walked past this post 200 times in the dark. He had never stopped at it. He stopped now. This was not the exact spot. The accident had been 3 miles further east. But this was the highway. This was the road. The same asphalt, the same shoulder, the same tree line pressing in on both sides. He had walked this road at 2 in the morning in the dark more times than he had counted, and he had never let himself stop and stand still on it, because standing still meant thinking, and thinking meant the weight of it, and the weight of it was considerable. He stood still now. He stood there and looked west in the direction Portland lay, in the direction a column of motorcycles had rolled several hours ago, carrying the last of a long brotherhood's obligations back out onto the roads they had always ridden. In the direction his father had been driving when the road decided something. He reached into his breast pocket and took out the Zippo. He turned it over in his fingers. The death's head caught the pale afternoon light and returned it. He held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the way it pressed Mick against his palm with the solidity of something that has been carried a long time by someone who needed it. He opened it. He struck the wheel. The flame came up clean and steady in the still air, a small, bright fact against the gray winter sky. He looked at it for a moment. Then he closed his hand around the lighter, cupping the flame, and blew it out. The smoke rose thin and straight in the cold air and disappeared. He stood on the shoulder of Highway 26 in the leather jacket of a man he would never meet, and he held the Zippo, and he looked west down the road. He thought about his father driving this road at the end of a long shift, tired, heading home the same direction Caleb was now facing. He thought about the ice and the guardrail, and the things that happen in seconds that become the shape of everything that follows. He thought about the way grief works, how it does not diminish exactly, but spreads, thins out over time until it is present everywhere at once rather than crushing in one place. He thought, Dad, I'm still here. I'm still on the road. A car passed, an old Subaru with a cracked taillight moving east toward the mountains. The driver did not look at him. The road returned to silence. Caleb Norris put the Zippo back in his breast pocket. He buttoned the pocket closed. He turned and walked back up the dirt road toward the trailer, his hands in his jacket pockets, the shearling warm against his chest, the pine trees on either side holding their silence, the way they always did, patient and complete. The porch light was on. His mother had left it on for him even though it was still afternoon, even though she was asleep, because she had been leaving the porch light on for him every night since he started working the graveyard shift, and she had not once suggested she would ever stop. He climbed the steps. He went inside. Behind him, the road went on in both directions, carrying its traffic and its weather and its history this way roads do, indifferent to the individual stories that move along them and through them and sometimes ended on them. It had been there before any of them were born. It would be there after. But on that particular Thursday afternoon, on a short stretch of dirt lane off Highway 26 in the Cascade foothills of Oregon, the tire tracks of nearly 70 motorcycles were pressed into the snow, and the cold kept them there, clear and deep, pointing west, as if pointing at something, as if saying someone came here. Someone stood in this place and settled a debt that needed settling. Someone looked a boy in the eye and told him that what he did in the dark when no one was watching was not nothing, was not wasted, was not stupid, was the kind of thing that gets remembered.